April 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing. American troops expected gunfire when they approached the camp. Instead, they found a train filled with the dead. What followed was not a simple story of liberation, but a moment when discipline and rage collided. This is the part of the story few textbooks fully explore. April 29, 1945. Southern Germany. Soldiers from the U.S. 45th Infantry Division and elements of the 42nd Infantry Division moved cautiously toward the concentration camp at Dachau. Intelligence reports suggested the area might still be defended by SS units. The men advanced in combat formation, weapons ready, expecting resistance. What they encountered first was silence. Then they saw the train. It stood on a rail spur just outside the camp, nearly 40 freight cars, doors sealed or slightly ajar. At first glance, it looked abandoned. But as the soldiers drew closer, a heavy, sickening odor drifted toward them. Many later said they recognized it immediately. Death has a smell. A small group approached one of the cars and pulled the sliding door open. Inside were bodies, piled on top of each other, tangled together as if they had fallen and never risen again. Emaciated men with sunken eyes and skeletal limbs. Some wore striped prisoner uniforms. Others were barefoot, ribs visible through gray skin stretched tight over bone. Limbs protruded at unnatural angles where the dead had shifted during transport. The train had arrived days earlier from Buchenwald. Prisoners had been transported in open freight cars without food, water, or sanitation. Many had died during the journey. Those who survived had been left inside with the corpses. Veterans who had endured Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France stood in stunned silence. These were not inexperienced recruits. They had seen men torn apart by artillery and machine gun fire. But this was something else entirely. There was no battlefield explanation here. No crossfire. No immediate combat necessity. This was deliberate. Words spread quickly along the column. Soldiers called others over, voices low but urgent, "You need to see this." Within minutes, the discovery rippled through the ranks. Faces hardened. Jaws tightened. Rumors of concentration camps had circulated for years. Reports of starvation, forced labor, and mass executions had been discussed in briefings and newspapers. Some soldiers had believed them fully. Others had struggled to grasp their scale. Standing beside the train, doubt disappeared. As American troops continued forward toward the camp gates, they began encountering living prisoners, skeletal figures barely able to walk, some collapsing from weakness as they tried to approach the soldiers. A few raised trembling hands in greeting. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, as if unsure whether the men before them were real. Meanwhile, SS guards inside the camp were beginning to surrender. The soldiers had expected a firefight. Instead, they had stepped into evidence of systematic death. In that moment, something shifted inside many of them. The mission was no longer just military. It felt personal. Discipline still held, but it was under strain. Liberation had begun. And the next hours would test the limits of control. The first shots inside Dachau were fired after the surrender had already begun. As American troops moved through the outer gate and secured the guard towers, small groups of SS personnel were rounded up. Some had thrown down their weapons immediately. Others attempted to blend into the chaos. A few had exchanged fire briefly before being overwhelmed. The camp courtyard became a holding area. Dozens of captured guards were lined up along a wall near a coal yard. Some stood rigid and silent. Others looked shaken, glancing nervously at the armed Americans facing them. The contrast was impossible to ignore, well-fed men in clean uniforms standing only yards away from prisoners who were barely alive. Around them, the camp revealed itself in fragments: overcrowded barracks, disease wards filled with the dying, crematorium structures that left little doubt about their purpose. The emotional pressure was building. Soldiers who had seen the train now walked past survivors weighing less than a child. Prisoners whispered stories in broken German and other languages. Some pointed toward the guards with trembling fingers. Others wept openly. A few inmates, fueled by rage and adrenaline, began attacking captured SS men whenever they could reach them. American officers shouted orders to maintain control. For a time, discipline held. Then, in the confusion near the courtyard, shots rang out. Accounts differ on the precise trigger, whether a guard moved suddenly, whether someone attempted to flee, or whether a nervous soldier reacted to perceived resistance. What is clear is that once the first shots were fired, others followed. Several SS guards fell where they stood. Officers immediately moved to stop the firing. Some physically pushed rifles downward. Others shouted ceasefire commands. Within minutes, control was reasserted. But the damage had been done. Elsewhere in the camp, isolated incidents occurred as small groups of Americans encountered guards while still processing what they had witnessed. In some cases, prisoners themselves beat or killed former captors before troops could intervene. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred. For many of the soldiers, the courtyard became the emotional breaking point. The images from the train and the barracks were still fresh. The realization of what had happened inside those fences, starvation, forced labor, systematic cruelty, was overwhelming. Training teaches restraint. War teaches survival. But Dachau introduced something else: moral shock. Senior commanders quickly recognized the danger. They ordered tighter control of prisoners, reassigned shaken troops, and attempted to restore clear chains of command. Liberation was still the mission. Yet in the courtyard, for a few chaotic minutes, discipline had faltered, and the psychological toll of what the soldiers had seen became impossible to ignore. As order was gradually restored in the courtyard, another force began to move through the camp: the prisoners themselves. For years they had lived under absolute control. Starvation, forced labor, beatings, executions. Now the guards who had ruled them stood disarmed, surrounded, uncertain. The psychological reversal was immediate and explosive. Some inmates were too weak to stand. They remained in the barracks, lying on wooden bunks, watching events unfold through open doorways. Others, driven by adrenaline and disbelief, staggered into the open yard. A few found sticks, tools, or scraps of wood. When isolated SS men were identified, prisoners sometimes rushed them. American soldiers faced an impossible balance. They were liberators, but also responsible for preventing further bloodshed. Shouts echoed across the compound in multiple languages. Survivors pointed at specific guards, accusing them of brutality. In several instances, American troops had to physically shield captured SS personnel from prisoners seeking revenge. Some guards were beaten before soldiers could intervene. At the same time, medics were confronting a humanitarian disaster. Thousands of prisoners were suffering from typhus, dysentery, and severe malnutrition. Camp facilities were overwhelmed. Many inmates could not process food safely after prolonged starvation. Army doctors quickly realized that improper feeding could kill as surely as hunger. Commanders established immediate priorities: secure the camp, separate prisoners from guards, and begin emergency medical operations. Senior officers moved deliberately to reassert structure. Clear orders were issued: no unauthorized shootings, no reprisals, all prisoners of war to be processed according to regulations. Guards were gathered, counted, and placed under armed supervision away from the inmate population. Yet tension lingered. For soldiers walking through the barracks, the scale of suffering remained overwhelming. Piles of bodies awaited burial. Survivors whispered stories of executions and medical experiments. Crematorium ovens stood as silent confirmation. The liberation had transformed into a moral confrontation. Many troops later described a numbness setting in, a protective emotional barrier after the initial shock and fury. Others struggled with anger long after leaving the campgrounds. Within hours, military photographers and signal corps units began documenting everything. Evidence had to be preserved. Reports had to be written. The world would need proof. The war in Europe was days from ending. But at Dachau, victory did not feel clean or triumphant. It felt heavy. In the space between justice and revenge, commanders worked to restore discipline, aware that history would one day judge not only the crimes uncovered there, but also how the liberators responded. By the evening of April 29, 1945, Dachau was fully under American control. The shooting had stopped. The guards who survived were confined and catalogued. Medical teams worked through the night. Engineers and support units began organizing food distribution, quarantine zones, and burial details. What had erupted in chaos that morning was slowly forced back into structure. But the emotional shock did not fade with the restoration of order. Within days, formal reports were filed. Commanders documented the shootings of SS personnel in the courtyard and elsewhere. Statements were taken. Some officers recommended courts-martial for those who had fired on surrendered prisoners. Others argued that the circumstances, the discovery of the train, the condition of the inmates, had created an extraordinary psychological rupture. An investigation was opened. In the end, no large-scale prosecutions of American soldiers took place. The war in Europe ended less than 2 weeks later, on May 8, 1945. Priorities shifted rapidly toward occupation, stabilization, and the coming trials of major Nazi leaders. The events at Dachau remained in reports and archives, acknowledged but not widely publicized. The larger horror of the camp overshadowed everything. Journalists, photographers, and members of Congress were brought to witness what had been uncovered. Images of emaciated survivors and railcars filled with corpses circulated across the United States. Public attention focused, understandably, on the crimes of the Nazi regime. The brief breakdown of discipline among liberating troops became a footnote. Yet for the soldiers who were there, it was not a footnote. Many carried the memory for decades. Some defended their actions as an inevitable human reaction to unimaginable cruelty. Others spoke quietly of the moment when anger nearly overtook training. A few rarely spoke of it at all. Dachau forced a confrontation not only with atrocity, but with the limits of moral endurance. War is often described in terms of strategy, territory, and victory. Liberation is portrayed as a clear moral triumph. But April 29 revealed something more complicated. Even righteous causes do not insulate human beings from emotional fracture. The discovery of the train changed the atmosphere instantly. The courtyard incident exposed how thin the line can be between justice and revenge when confronted with systematic evil. Commanders restored control, but the moment could not be erased. This story matters because it resists simplicity. It reminds us that the end of war is not clean. That liberation can coexist with rage. That discipline can strain under the weight of horror. And that history is not only about what was defeated, but about how those who defeated it chose to act in the face of the unimaginable.